A plantation owner in Virginia sold a pregnant slave woman for 25 cents in March 1852. Not dollars, but cents. She was called Rose. James Whitfield, a poor white farmer, bought it. 6 months later, he did the unthinkable. He married Rose and her newborn son after freeing them, which was against Virginia law. James was in jail by Christmas, Rose was told to leave Virginia for good, and their son was made property again. What made a poor farmer ruin his life for a woman who was sold for 25 cents? And what happened to the child Virginia tried to get rid of? Before we find out what they buried, please leave a comment with your city and time. We love to see where these stories go. With hands that had learned to be gentle from 23 years of coaxing secrets from paper, Margaret Chen pulled a brittle document out of a sealed tin box. The archive room smelled like dust and lemon oil, and the fluorescent lights made the same noise they always did at 4:30 inches the afternoon when she was alone with the dead. 3 weeks ago, this box came from an estate sale in Stunton. It was part of a collection that no one wanted: farm records, old receipts, and the financial mess of families that had run out of descendants who cared. She had been carefully going through everything, making a list of each item with the accuracy that her job required and her personality craved, when she found the bill of sale hidden between 2 pages of an 1852 almanac. The paper was yellow-brown, like dried leaves, and it was written on in the confident handwriting of someone who had signed his name to these deals 1,000 times before. Margaret read it 3 times. One Negro woman named Rose, age about 22 years, sold by Cullen Edund Fairfax to Mr. James Whitfield. Price paid 0 to 25 vols. She then put it down on the exam table, took off her glasses, cleaned them with the edge of a cardigan, and put them back on. A quarter. Not $25, which is the cost of a pound of coffee, a spool of thread, or a newspaper. An auction in 1852 sold an enslaved person for between $800 and $1,200, depending on their age, health, and skills. A strong young man in his prime could bring in $1,500. People who were old or disabled sold for at least $100 because their work was still useful. This is because cruelty has its own economy, and nothing was wasted. 25 cents meant that something was very, very wrong. Margaret opened the census records on her computer. The fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. In the 1850 Augusta County Census, James Whitfield was listed as a white man, 26 years old, a farmer with 47 acres of land, worth $200, and no slaves. She looked at tax records from 1851 and found him again. He still hadn't claimed any slaves and was still living on that small piece of land in a county where plantation owners owned hundreds of acres and dozens of people as property. He was nobody, a poor white farmer barely making ends meet, the kind of guy rich planters looked through as if he were made of glass. What would make Colonel Edmund Fairfax, who owned 1,400 acres and 200 slaves, sell this man a woman for the price of a newspaper? On the back of the document, Margaret saw a note in faded brown ink along the edge that said, "Woman with child, infirm, accepted as damaged goods." Below that, in a different handwriting that was darker and more recent, it said, "Condition misrepresented." She took pictures of both sides of the document with the archive's high-resolution camera, a pulse doing something it hadn't done in months or even years. This wasn't a normal transaction. It was a disposal. She started gathering all the information she could find about James Whitfield. His name was in court records, tax returns, and a property deed from 1848 when he bought the land from his dead father's estate. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that explained why he would buy a pregnant slave woman who was marked as defective, or what he planned to do with her once he did. Then she discovered the ledger. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were sewn together with thread that had turned rust-colored with age. Every entry was written in the same careful hand that had signed the bill of sale. James Whitfield kept very detailed records. March 20th, 1852, paid Kalia Fairfax S.E. 25 for woman Rose. March 23rd, bought fabric, 4 yards for dress. March 28th, called Dr. Hensley, paid $150. Examination, April 2nd, 1852. Rose delivered of a son. Mother and child survived. I thank Providence. The last line was underlined twice. Margaret leaned back in her chair and put her hands over her eyes. For a short, stupid time, she let herself think that this might be a story about a rescue. James Whitfield might have been an abolitionist, a secret Quaker, or someone who bought slaves just to set them free. He might have heard about Rose's situation and stepped in. In a world that had forgotten the word, this might have been mercy. April 10th. Bought a crib, blankets, and clothes for the baby. April 18th. Rose's fever broke. May 3rd. Paid the midwife $2. May 15th. Bought shoes for Rose. June 8th. Bought fabric, more thread, and soap. He was spending money he didn't have. She looked at his property records and found the land assessment. 47 acres of average soil, a small cabin, 1 plow, and 2 mules. He didn't have a lot of money. He wasn't even at ease. But here he was, buying medicine, fabric, and paying doctors, writing down every expense like a man who is afraid he will need to defend himself someday. June 22nd, 1852. Received letter from Kershaw Fairfax. Demanded return of property. Consulted attorney T. Garrett. The sentence sat there like a trap door opening beneath her feet. 3 pages later, she found the letter, folded and pressed flat between ledger entries like a dead bug. The paper was thick and expensive, and the writing was sharp and beautiful. Mr. Whitfield, it began. I write to inform you that the child born to the woman Rose on or about April 2nd of this year remains by law the property of this estate. As said woman was in my legal possession at the time of conception, you will return the child to Fairfax Hall no later than July the 1st, 1852, or I will pursue all legal remedies available under Virginia statute. The child is mine by law. I expect compliance. It was signed Edmund Fairfax in a flourish of ink that looked like a whip crack. Margaret read the letter twice, then put it down and went to the window. There was only her car and the maintenance truck in the parking lot outside. The edges of the sky were turning purple. She hadn't noticed that she had been in this room for 6 hours. She put her forehead against the glass and whispered the truth so she could hear how it sounded. He raped her, got her pregnant, and then sold her to cover it up. But the law in Virginia was clear. When a woman was a slave and had a child, the child belonged to the woman who owned her. Fairfax sold Rose when she was 8 months pregnant, probably hoping she would die in labor or the baby would be stillborn, or that both problems would just go away in the anonymous violence of slavery. But she lived. The baby lived. And now Fairfax wanted him back because an enslaved baby was worth $500 and growing, because prices went up, and because he could. Margaret went back to the table and turned to the next page of the ledger. July 5th, 1852. Met with attorney Garrett. Will not give up the child. God help me, I will not. The handwriting was jagged and pressed so hard into the paper that it tore in 2 places. Margaret didn't think this was a rescue. James Whitfield had just walked into this trap, with his eyes wide open. The next morning, Margaret went back to the archive with coffee she didn't drink and a notebook full of timelines. She didn't sleep. She saw the bill of sale every time she closed her eyes. 25 cents, the cost of throwing away a person. She put James Whitfield's diary on the examination table. It had 70 pages of daily entries written in ink that had faded from black to gray-brown over 173 years. As the months went by, the writing changed. In March, it was neat and controlled, like the writing of a man who had learned how to write and practiced it. It was tighter and more important by June. By July, the letters were leaning hard to the right, as if the words were trying to get away from the page. She started on June 10, the day after Fairfax's letter came. James wrote, I read his letter 3 times before I understood what he was asking. No, not asking, demanding. He wants the child, Rose's son, the baby she nearly died bringing into this world. He wants him back so he can sell him. I know what Colonel Fairfax is. I know what he did to her. Every man in this county knows, and no one speaks of it because silence is how power protects itself. But I will not send the child. I do not care what the law says. I will not. Margaret took a picture of the page and kept reading. June 15th, Rose knows. I did not tell her about the letter, but she knows anyway. She has that look women get when they have survived things men cannot imagine. That watchfulness, like she is always calculating how much time remains before the door breaks down. This morning she asked me what I planned to do. I told her I would fight. She laughed, but it was not a happy sound. She said, "You cannot fight him. He is the law." I said I would try anyway. She looked at me like I was a child who still believes in miracles. Margaret put her camera down and looked out the window. Rose was right. Edmund Fairfax was the law in Virginia in 1852. He was a member of the county court. He was friends with the governor. He was the sheriff's brother's owner. It wasn't a legal battle for a poor white farmer to fight a plantation owner over who owned an enslaved child. It was suicide. James kept writing, and Margaret kept reading. The story that came out on those cramped pages wasn't what she thought it would be. 3 documents later, Margaret found the court filing. It was like evidence in a case that was still being tried. Edmund Fairfax versus James Whitfield, filed July 3rd, 1852. Augusta County Circuit Court. 3 documents later, Margaret found the court filing. It was like evidence in a case that was still going on. Edmund Fairfax versus James Whitfield, filed the 3rd of July, 1852, in the Augusta County Circuit Court. Dispute over property and getting back a minor who was enslaved. The language was cold, technical, and lacked any human touch. People called the child the Negro boy, said property, and cattle born of the woman Rose. There was no name, no humanity, just a thing to be returned to its rightful owner, like a stolen horse. But Margaret was shocked by the answer. James didn't just hire a lawyer. He also filed a counterclaim. She found it paper-clipped to the original petition, and her hands shook as she opened it. James Whitfield was asking for full custody of the child, and Rose's full freedom. The document said that Fairfax had sold Rose under false pretenses, that the pregnancy had been kept secret, that the sale price of 25 cents meant giving up both the mother and the child, and that Fairfax's attempt to get the baby back was fraud. It was bold. It was crazy. It was also completely doomed. Margaret flipped to the next diary entry. July 8th. Garrett says, "We have no chance. He says the judge will laugh us out of the courtroom. He says I should settle. Agree to return the child in exchange for Fairfax dropping the case. I asked him what he would do if it were his son. He did not answer. Today I made an offer to Fairfax through Garrett. I will purchase the child's freedom for $1,200. It is more than I have. It is more than the land is worth. But I will find it somehow. I will mortgage everything. I will borrow. I will beg." 4 days later, Fairfax replied, and Margaret found it in its original envelope, with the wax seal cracked, but still intact. She opened it carefully with a bone folder, like she had been taught to do with things that were fragile and might break if they were touched too hard. "Mr. Whitfield, I agree to your offer of $1 for the boy. However, I need one more condition. You must also pay $800 for the full freedom of the woman Rose. The total is $2,000, or I will sell her to a trader going to New Orleans within a week. You have until July 20th to pay. After that, both the woman and the child will go back to my custody." Margaret read the letter twice and then opened a historical inflation calculator on her laptop. In 1852, $2,000 was about the same as $73,000 today. James Whitfield had 2 mules and 47 acres of not very good farmland. He didn't have $73,000. He didn't have $7,000. Fairfax was aware of that. There was no negotiation. It was a trap with 2 doors, and both led to loss. James would go bankrupt if he paid, and he would have to sell his land just to stay alive. If he didn't pay, Rose would be sold south to work in the cotton fields, where people only lived for a few years, and her son would stay Fairfax's property and do whatever he wanted with it. Margaret turned back to the diary. July 15th. I signed the mortgage papers today. The land, the cabin, the tools, everything. The banker looked at me like I was mad. He said, "You are destroying yourself for a woman who is not your wife and a child who is not your son." I did not correct him. How could I explain that I am not destroying myself? I am trying to save the only part of myself worth keeping. Tomorrow I will deliver the payment to Fairfax. Garrett drew up the emancipation papers. Rose will be free. The boy will be free. And I will be a man who chose what was right over what was easy. That has to be enough. Margaret found the manumission papers behind the diary. They say that Rose and her baby son Samuel are legally free as of the 20th of July, 1852. The signatures were seen, notarized, and kept in the county clerk's office. It happened. It was a contract. For a brief moment, reading those pages in the quiet of the fluorescent-lit archive room made Margaret feel something like hope. Then she saw the note. It was attached to the back of the emancipation papers and written in a different hand, probably Thomas Garrett's. It said, "Papers legally valid but unenforceable under Virginia Act of 1806. All emancipated Negroes must leave the Commonwealth within 12 months of manumission or be sold back into slavery. Rose Whitfield and child must leave Virginia by July 20th, 1853 or go back to slavery." Margaret shut the file and put her hands flat on the table. James had gone bankrupt to set them free, but Virginia law said they couldn't stay. 3 weeks after she started going through James Whitfield's papers, Margaret found the document she couldn't believe on a Thursday afternoon in late October. It was folded up and put inside a leather pouch behind a stack of seed catalogs and farm receipts. When she opened it, the paper crackled like dry fire. Virginia marriage license. This document certifies that James Whitfield, a 8-year-old white man, and Rose, a 2-year-old black woman, were married on the 3rd of October 1852, in the presence of God and these witnesses. Abigail Thornton, the minister of the Religious Society of Friends, signed it, and 3 people whose names Margaret didn't know saw it. The certificate was not real. Virginia law said that white and black people could not get married. Since 1691, it had been against the law. Would keep it illegal until 1967, when the Supreme Court finally overturned the ban in Loving versus Virginia. This piece of paper was not only not valid, it was also proof of a crime. But here it was, carefully kept and filed with James's most important papers, as if it were a property deed. Margaret took pictures of it from every angle, then sat back in her chair and tried to figure out what James was thinking. She went back to the diary and read, August 5th, 1852. Rose is now legally free, but the freedom is empty. The law says she must leave Virginia within 12 months or be enslaved again. If she goes to Ohio or Pennsylvania, she can stay free. But Samuel is only 4 months old, so the journey would be dangerous, maybe impossible, for a woman alone with a baby. And if she stays here even 1 day past the deadline, the state will take her and sell her at auction like she was never free at all. I have been awake for 2 nights trying to see a way forward. This morning I asked Rose to marry me. Margaret stopped reading and looked up at the ceiling. The lights that were fluorescent made a buzzing sound. A door closed somewhere down the hall. She went back to the diary. Rose did not answer right away. She stood at the window holding Samuel, looking out at the fields, and I could not see her face. When she finally spoke, a voice was so quiet I almost could not hear. She said, "How can a woman who has been owned ever truly choose? You are kind, James. You have been good to me and to my son, but I do not know if what I feel is gratitude or something else. I do not know if I am capable of love, or if that part of me died a long time ago." I told her I was not asking for love. I was asking for a way to keep her and Samuel safe. If we marry, she becomes my wife. Samuel becomes my legal heir. Under the law, this is impossible, but I know a Quaker meeting house across the Pennsylvania line. They will marry us. And when we return to Virginia as husband and wife, Perhaps the law will hesitate before it tries to separate us." Rose turned from the window and looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I will marry you, not because I choose, but because it is the only door left open." Margaret found the witness statements behind the marriage certificate. There were 3 sworn statements that described the ceremony. Abigail Thornton wrote, "I married James Whitfield and Rose before God and this community on October 3rd, 1852, in the 3rd Street Meeting House, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania." The bride was composed and clear in her consent. The groom wept through his vows. I asked Rose privately before the ceremony if she came to this marriage of her own will or from necessity. She answered, "I come because it is the only safe place left. I believe that is as much consent as any woman in her position can give. I witnessed their hands join, and I prayed that this union, though illegal in Virginia, might be recognized in the eyes of a God who does not measure worth by the color of skin." The other witnesses wrote shorter statements, but all confirmed the same facts. The ceremony took place. It was real. James and Rose went back to Virginia as husband and wife, knowing they could be arrested, knowing their marriage wasn't legal, and knowing that choosing each other was an act of defiance that could cost them everything. Margaret looked at property records again and found something she had missed before. James Whitfield registered Rose as a member of his household in November 1852. She was not a servant or a dependent. She was his wife. The county clerk wrote it down without saying anything, probably because no one cared what poor white farmers did on their marginal land. Or maybe the clerk just didn't believe what he was seeing and decided to act like he hadn't seen it at all. They lived together as husband and wife in Augusta County, Virginia, for 3 months. Margaret went back to the diary and read entries that got shorter, simpler, and almost peaceful. For example, on October 18th, Rose is learning to read. I teach her in the evenings after Samuel sleeps. She learns faster than I did. On November 3rd, Rose sang while cooking. I didn't know she could sing. The sound filled the cabin like light. On November 22nd, Samuel spoke his first word. He said, "App." I cried. Rose held my hand and said nothing, but her grip was strong, and I understood what she couldn't say. On December 10th, I have known happiness I do not deserve. Rose smiles now, true smiles that reach her eyes. She sleeps without waking in terror. Samuel grows strong. We are a family. However strange, however illegal, I am content. 3 times Margaret read the last entry. I am content. 4 words, and they were the most important things in the file. James and Rose had built something real for 3 months. It wasn't perfect or easy, but it was real. Then she found the newspaper article. It was a yellow and brittle piece of paper from the Staunton Spectator, dated the 23rd of December, 1852, that was stuck between the pages of December 15 and 16. The headline said, "Scandal in Augusta County. White farmer arrested for cohabitation with Negro." Margaret's stomach turned. The article was short and written in the cool, judgmental style of 19th century journalism. Mr. James Whitfield, age 28, of Augusta County, was arrested on December 22nd for living with a black woman in violation of the Commonwealth's laws against race mixing. The woman, identified as Rose, was also arrested for living in Virginia beyond the terms of her manumission. Their infant child, a mulatto boy, has been declared abandoned property and remanded to the custody of the court. Mr. Whitfield faces fines and imprisonment. The case has scandalized local society and serves as a reminder that Virginia's laws exist to preserve moral order and racial purity. Edmund Fairfax, the woman's former owner, brought the charges after receiving reports of the unlawful arrangement. Margaret put the clipping down and put her hands on her face. 3 months. They had 3 months of peace. 3 months of pretending the world might let them be. And then Fairfax, who couldn't stand losing and couldn't stand being defied by a poor white farmer and a woman he had once owned, destroyed it all. She found James's last diary entry, dated the 21st of December, 1852, the day before his arrest. Tomorrow is the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Rose and I sat by the fire tonight after Samuel went to sleep. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. We both know they are coming. Fairfax has been watching, gathering testimony, building his case. Thomas Garrett warned me yesterday that charges have been filed. By this time tomorrow I will likely be in jail. Rose will be taken. Samuel will be declared property again. I have failed them. I wanted to believe that righteousness could defeat law, that if I just loved her honorably enough, chose what was right loudly enough, the world would see reason. I was wrong, but I would do it again. I would choose her again. I would choose Samuel again. That has to mean something, even if it changes nothing. The handwriting on that last page was steady, clear, the script of a man who had made his peace with consequences. Margaret closed the diary and sat in the quiet archive room, knowing exactly what James Whitfield had done. He did not save Rose. He hadn't beaten the system. He had just refused to help her destroy herself, even though he knew it would destroy him instead. And on Christmas Eve, 1852, Virginia came to get her money. Margaret found the trial transcripts in a manila folder with the words Commonwealth vs. Whitfield, January 1853 on it. Her hands shook when she opened it. 70 pages of testimony, written by a court clerk, in very small handwriting. The clerk had written down everything that was said in that Augusta County courtroom. The trial took 2 days. James was accused of living with a black man without permission, which is a crime that can lead to fines of up to $500 and jail time of up to 12 months. Rose had been charged with living in the country illegally, which meant she would be sold and forced back into slavery. The state could take Samuel, who was 8 months old, because he was abandoned property. Margaret started reading and couldn't put it down. Judge William Preston presided over the trial, which began on the 9th of January, 1853. James was represented by Thomas Garrett. No one spoke for Rose because enslaved and free black people in Virginia couldn't get legal help. The prosecution called 3 witnesses. A neighbor who said he had seen James and Rose living together as husband and wife. A shopkeeper who said James had bought things for Rose and the child. And Colonel Edmund Fairfax himself, who said he had sold Rose in good faith and was shocked to find out that James had broken Virginia's moral laws by treating her as an equal. Fairfax talked for 20 minutes about the natural order, how important it was to keep races separate, and how dangerous men like James were who didn't respect the rules that kept society stable. The transcript recorded his exact words. This defendant has committed an offense against God and Virginia. He has taken a Negro woman into his home, not as a servant, but as a companion. He has claimed her child as his own. He has rejected the wisdom of his ancestors and embraced a perversion that threatens every principle upon which this commonwealth was built. I do not seek vengeance, I seek order. The law must be enforced, or we descend into chaos. Margaret read those words twice and felt the same anger she always felt when she saw men who dressed cruelty in the language of civilization. Fairfax had sex with Rose when she was 14. He sold her for 25 cents while she was pregnant, and now he was in a courtroom talking about morality and order. She flipped the page. Thomas Garrett cross-examined Fairfax, and the transcript showed that he had tried to tell the truth as best he could. "Mr. Garrett asked, "Colonel, is it not true that you sold Rose for 25 cents because she was pregnant with your child and you want to hide that fact?" Fairfax replied, "I sold her because she was sick and of no use to my estate. Any other interpretation is slander." Mr. Garrett asked, "Is it not true that you only demanded the child's return after learning he had survived birth?" Fairfax replied, "The child is my property by law. I have every right to reclaim what is mine." The judge upheld the prosecutor's objection and told the jury to ignore the question. Garrett had tried to make the jury doubt Fairfax's motives, but Virginia law didn't care about motives. The law cared about order, and James had broken it. James then gave his testimony. Margaret read his testimony 3 times slowly, hearing his voice in the careful syntax, the plain words, and the fact that he didn't try to downplay or excuse what he had done. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Whitfield, did you live with a black woman?" James replied, "I married her. We lived as husband and wife. The prosecutor then asked, "You know that such a marriage is against the law in Virginia?" James replied, "I know the law. I think the law is wrong." The courtroom erupted. James was threatened with contempt by the judge. James kept talking, even though Garrett tried to stop him. The transcript has a lot of detail about what he said, almost as if the clerk couldn't believe what he was hearing. James said, "I freed Rose because slavery is wrong. I married her because it was the right thing to do. I won't say I'm sorry for choosing mercy over law. I won't say what I did was a crime when the real crime was what Colonel Fairfax did to her for 8 years. You say my actions were wrong. I say they were the only Christian choice I had." James was told by the judge to be quiet. The prosecutor asked for a guilty verdict right away. And then, even though it was against the rules and the law, the judge let Rose testify. Margaret didn't know why. The judge might have been curious. He might have wanted to make her feel bad. He might have thought that her testimony would make James's conviction stronger. Rose was called to the stand, sworn in, and given 3 minutes to speak. The transcript recorded her words exactly. "My name is Rose. I was born in Southampton County in 1830. I was sold away from my mother when I was 9 years old. Colonel Fairfax purchased me when I was 13. He came to my cabin when I was 14, and I could not refuse him because I was his property, and property does not refuse. He did this for 8 years. When I became pregnant, he sold me for 25 cents. Like I was a sick animal he wanted gone. Mr. Whitfield bought me. And he did something no white man had ever done. He asked my permission. He asked if I needed a doctor. He asked if I wanted to keep my son. For the first time in my life, someone treated me like I was human. You call this a crime. I call it the only mercy I have known in Virginia." Margaret put the transcript down and went to the window. It was dark outside and past 7 p.m., and she had been reading for hours. Rose's statement in the official record was 3 paragraphs long and less than 200 words, but those words meant more